Welcome, everyone. I know you can't see me, but my name is Abby Bickford and I look after marketing here at SureComp. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on next generation trade finance digitization, preparing for electronic trade documents, which, as we all know, is currently a very pressing topic as we're emerging slowly from the pandemic and thinking ahead to the new legislation that's coming down the track. And thanks to all of you who provided comments and questions in your registration form, which has really helped to reinforce the discussion points that we'll be focusing on today, including particularly what does trade digitization look like right now? What benefits and opportunities can be leveraged from the legislative changes that are coming? And what to consider if you're embarking on or about to embark on a digitization journey. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you all that is obviously usual practice in webinars like this. The session is being recorded and will be available on demand afterwards. And you are automatically muted, but do feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A because we would like this to be as informative as possible. And if you have pressing questions, do pose them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. And if not, we'll take them offline with you afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Deepesh Patel, who I'm sure many of you have seen before. He's the editorial director of one of our industry's most esteemed publications and our media partner for today's webinar, Trade Finance Global. And Deepesh will be joined today by essDOCS CEO Alexander Gulandris and SureComp's SVP of Strategy, Digitization and Business Development, Enno Burkhard-Weitzel. So, Deepesh, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. My name is Deepesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global. Thanks, Abby, for the kind introduction to moderate this webinar. So, trade digitalization, probably the hottest buzzword in our industry. Should it be, or is it just another passing trend? COVID has indeed highlighted the need to address some of the long-standing issues in the industry, the paper-reliant nature of trade being one of them. With the limited mobility of people and goods, verifying physical documents has been a huge challenge for trade throughout the pandemic. In a recent report by the WTO, ICC and TFG entitled Blockchain and DLT for Trade, Where Do We Stand? We tracked some 54 different projects and companies in trade, trade finance, supply chain finance, shipping logistics, and trade credit insurance, noting this March that companies have significantly matured over the course of the 12 months in this space. We're no longer testing the water, but actually these companies, which in this case use DLT, which is one of the many disruptive technologies, are actually processing live transactions. So what now? It's got more complex. Are companies competing or do they want to partner up? What does a fully digitized trade finance solution look like? And how does a successful partnership look? This is exactly what we will be exploring in this panel session today. So today I'm delighted to be joined by two very established industry experts, Enno Burkhard-Weitzel at SureComp and Alexander Gulandris at essDOCS. Welcome and thank you for joining.
Hi, Deepesh.
So to start off with, I'll ask you both to give a quick elevator pitch. So in no more than 30 seconds, who are you, where are you from, and what do you do? Enno, I'll start with you.
Well, thanks very much. Well, I'm heading the strategy of SureComp, and we're here to innovate the trade finance tech side, enabling corporates and banks to gain efficiency in handling their trade instruments.
And Alex, over to you.
I run one of the founders and CEOs of essDOCS. We're a leading paperless trade provider, enabling digitization of the documentation and the processes around import, export, and trade finance.
Thank you very much. So we're going to split this panel session up into three pillars or themes: the current new world of trade, digital transformation and what that actually looks like, and how partnerships and collaborations could work. Now, I invite the attendees to post in questions via the Q&A, and I can pass those on to Alex and Ene throughout the discussion to aid the conversation. So to start off with, in our first kind of theme, new world of trade, Alex, what does the world of trade look like today versus pre-COVID?
I mean, I think in many ways it looks quite similar, right? I mean, it's not possible to have holistic industry-wide changes of processes overnight. The trade industry is too complicated. There are too many participants. There's governmental elements involved. So what we've seen is a massive shift to temporary solutions. A lot of scanning of documentation. Regulators have allowed this. The ICC has even recommended this at the very beginning of COVID, because when courier companies stopped working, when people were unable to get to their offices, obviously the paperwork wasn't able to get through the trade finance supply chain. So essentially, we've seen a hodgepodge of patches of solutions, but they're temporary. They add risk to the whole process, and they're going to need to get unwound pretty quickly.
Ene, what are your thoughts? Are these just temporary?
Yes, they are. Because all the players in the industry, they do trade-off decisions all the time. And if you have to trade off between not getting physical documents at all, or running the risk of having a signature on the paper, a PDF signature on a PDF paper that might not be court-proof, well, you may easily decide for getting some sort of document rather than not getting document at all. Now that courier services are working again, the trade-off background is yet shifted again, because now you can choose to have paper again and be court-proven, instead of running the risk of not being court-proven and just having a digital document. So therefore, I completely agree with Alex saying all we see during pandemic is temporary. It's not a true digital document solution yet. So therefore, we run the risk that this being temporary, we fall back to where we've been pre-COVID.
So just to clarify, right now we're seeing a kind of hybrid paper and digital documents as a result of the pandemic. There currently is the risk that things will revert back to paper.
Absolutely. So that's what we hear from the discussions with our clients. There are major trade banks that only now, say first half this year, have gone through the legal process of internally approving DocuSign, so electronic signature of PDF documents. Now turning the temporary need or being forced to use somehow or accept somehow digitally signed documents from their clients during pandemic to make this a steady, a stable solution going forward. A major trade bank only now. Another corporate client of us in the logistics industry said, well, they just in March this year kicked out the fax out of their environment to communicate with the banks. So we see a huge range of, say, status quo where companies, where players in the industry are with their, say, digitization journey. So these temporary solutions, they are good in terms of all the participants got used to working with digital solutions, but we as the players in the industry now need to push for making these solutions permanent and push for different technical solutions in that space.
I think there's also another sort of counter element to this, which is, I think this time is different, right? We always have these conversations, is trade digitization in a different position? There's two elements with COVID that I think really are dramatically different. One is the shift to home working or hybrid working. I do not think will be unwound, right? You see Apple come out saying you need to come back to the office, and mass resignations. In fact, there's been so many resignations post-COVID. It's called the Great Resignation at the moment. It's the new mantra for what's happening in the world. And that's not unique to trade. That's in all companies all over the globe. It's starting to see this. So I think the demand for hybrid working means digitization needs to be part of your core processes. The second element is, historically, everyone's always said, well, paper works, it's not great, but it works. COVID proved that there are actually occasions where it doesn't work. And so it is impossible for a chief risk officer today to sit there and go, no, we should maintain only a process based on paperwork, when there's clear faults and holes in a paper-based trade process.
Yeah, absolutely. And therefore, say the framework of the immobility of people is no longer the true restriction, right? The default is, yes, paper can move, but it shouldn't.
So let's talk about some of the key market changes, because I think a lot of this, from a chief risk officer perspective, or even from a legal perspective, and actually looking at some of the notes and questions from attendees pre signing up to this webinar, a lot of it is around the acceptance of digital documents under English law, and I think there are still quite a lot of challenges here. Alex, can you summarize some of those key market changes around the actual acceptance of some of these digital documents?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's different types of title documents: bills of lading, bills of exchange, promissory notes, etc. And unfortunately, they're not all governed by the same law. So to upgrade your laws, you often need to upgrade multiple laws. If we focus on, for example, the bill of lading, there were a few countries that for a long time have recognized electronic bills of lading. The US, for example, has for at least 20 years. Korea has. There's been a lot of momentum, though, recently in a UN UNCITRAL piece of model law called the Model Law on Transferable Records, on Electronic Transferable Records, MLETR. And MLETR was, I think, first adopted by Bahrain, more recently in part of Abu Dhabi and Singapore. And there's quite a lot of momentum coming in 2020 for a number of other countries to adopt it. The G7 recently said that they were going to adopt it within the next 12 months. And obviously the G7 captures obviously the UK and a number of other big countries in Europe that I'd say legally have been quite behind. Now, that would make an EBL valid at the local law level, and actually the model law captures all those 4 title documents, not just the bill of lading. So by adopting that simultaneously, you've actually updated your legislation for all 4 types. So there's big momentum coming in with that, which will help a lot, but ultimately there are solutions today that work. The problem is that they're based on contracts that everyone needs to sign, so that takes time. But ultimately change management, even of the technical side, takes time. So a lot of people sit there and say this is a legal problem. I think digital trade is actually much more of a change management problem, and always has been.
Yeah, maybe so just adding to this for the sake of the audience that may not be too familiar with the legal differences of this, just from a different perspective, Alex, you were pointing on this, the difference between the EBLs, just as one example, that we see today and those based on the MLETR, so the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, is that we're changing from a contract to a legally based foundation. And the key difference in implementation is with a contract, so a club version of a contract that every participant needs to sign, we all know that every institution that we are belonging to has its own legal colleague that has its own view on how contracts should be formed and how they should be signed, that it will simply take ages to have mass adoption. Now, when in contrast, there is a national law that is governing these instruments, well, the local legal colleague in the department, well, he can simply do the quick check. Is the law enacted in all the legislations that we are active in? Yes, no, deal done. We can participate in using electronic bills of lading. So the adoption process will massively be upscaled and be less costly because there won't be that many legal checks. So just for the sake of this, and therefore also I think it's the duty of all of us to push for MLETR to be enacted in the locations that we're working in. And so maybe everyone in the audience can turn to its local politician, member of parliament, just make sure that it's on the agenda of the lawmaking process in the nations, because it will dramatically increase efficiency. There was a study done by the team of Coriolis, and I think also Trade Finance Global, yeah, that try to assess the impact of G7 Melita implementation. I think for the UK, they estimated to be more than 200 million pounds worth of efficiency gain. If you compare this to the GDP of the UK, that would be almost 10% GDP increase. Now, you may question whether that's the real number, but the dimension of this is massive and not to be underestimated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the English Law Commission is doing some great work, and it looks like we'll see some quite positive news. I think we have a bit of a workaround at the moment when it comes to the acceptance of transferable records, but I think 2022 will be quite an interesting year for the adoption of the UNCITRAL MLETR. Let's go on to the next session or the next theme, which is the actual digitization journey. And Enno, what does digital transformation look like for both a corporate and a bank? And I know we mentioned getting rid of the fax machine earlier.
Yeah, I think Alex also already seeded this. It's change management. First and foremost, it's not a legal topic. It's not a technical topic, even though, of course, it will touch as legal and technology aspects. And there's not the one blueprint that fits all corporates, so all companies, neither corporates nor banks. But if you want to embark on a digitization journey, there are some elements that appear to be universally, say, supportive. It's make sure it's a top management agenda point, and you have the support and sponsorship of top management. And then the second one is make the case for your specific situation. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to use digitization to boost your revenues? Do you want to cut your cost? Do you want to reduce your compliance risk? What exactly is it that you want to achieve with digitization? Because as mentioned and touched before, digitization has many aspects. So once you got your goal right, then activate the early adopters in your organization, because you will have challenges in your organization along various dimensions, and you need supporters, not only top management, but definitely you do. And you need the early adopters, the evangelists that you can push out to the organization to make the case and to propose the need for change. And you will always be faced with the question, why now? So once you made the case for why change at all, in terms of highlighting the goal that you want to achieve, you will always be challenged, why now, right? We saw that the pandemic has made a shift. G7 is adopting it. So you want to be ready when the market is ready, when your competition is ready. And if you don't believe that your competition will be ready, well, then you definitely want to be ready if your competition is not. So I think these, to me, would be elements that are supporting any digitization journey.
Yeah. And Alex, actually, question from the audience here, Ricardo. Do you think that implementation costs of digital solutions is a key factor when talking about temporary solutions versus permanent solutions?
I think temporary solutions were implemented because they had to be. I think ultimately people weren't going to get paid if temporary solutions didn't come in. So I think that there is a COVID patchwork of solutions that were just necessities. I think if you, in a post-COVID world and you're back to some form of normality, I don't think the temporary solutions will be allowed. Right? I think you're going to get to a point where the bank regulator is no longer going to say it's acceptable to accept a scan of a paper original. You need to get the bank the paper original. So the temporary will get killed very quickly, almost as quickly as it appeared. So I don't think temporary is an issue. I don't think it's a question of temporary versus permanent. There's obviously a cost of implementing digital solutions, but to Enno's point, digital solutions are inevitable, right? We're no longer in a position where the option is will I, the option is when will I. And so I think probably one of the other points I would make to Enno's implementation guide is a time element to it. You're going to have your goals, but your question is, am I looking at this from a 2-year perspective or a 5-year perspective or a 10-year perspective? Because actually that's going to change, right? Because if I want to digitize my export document, first I digitize my documents, and it depends on which trade you're in, right? But if I'm an agri trading house, I'm going to need to digitize my bill of lading, my certificate of origin, and my phytosanitary, because those 3 documents are the key under a letter of credit. Not digitizing one of those actually eradicates a lot of the benefits for me, right? Whereas in a different trade, it's going to be a different set of goals and documents to digitize. But then my next level is, okay, now I want to do e-presentation to the bank. Maybe I want to get rid of the letter of credit, right? But if you try and do all of these simultaneously, you'll almost certainly fail, right? If you make the project too complicated and too much change, people can't handle too much change. So you also need a temporal element of going, okay, phase 1, I'm going to do this. Phase 2, I'm going to increase the digitization, increase the automation.
Sure. So let's talk a bit more practically. And Enno, would you give any tips or advice for companies who are just getting started on that journey? Because I think what I'm gauging here is a lot of the big trade banks really are just getting started on their trade digitization journey. Where would you start?
Well, as Alex pointed out, this is very specific to the industry, to the size of the company, and to the business that the company is doing. So I don't have the crystal ball, and there's no uniform blueprint. But again, it's only to reiterate, analyze the processes, work from the goal that you want to achieve. So take efficiency gain as an example, because it's an obvious one. Analyze your process and work on the pain points first that cause the biggest pain today. And then don't hesitate to reach out to other industry players asking for help. So what I observe during pandemic, and I think it's universal, we are all perfectly willing to share our experiences. And with this, well, eventually make another player in the industry somewhat stronger, because you support him during the digitization journey. But in trade, we're all living in co-opetition, right? So we cooperate in fields and we compete in other fields. And there's a strong, say, glue in that industry. So reach out, ask others for support. How did you solve this? Is it good that we do? And then you will find your way. But I don't have the one size fits all solution at my hand.
And I guess that goes on to the final theme of today's webinar, which is collaboration or co-opetition, as you called it, Enno, and partnerships. I'm going to ask both of you, have you seen increased collaboration between fintechs and also fintechs and banks, and also what's driving this? Alex, perhaps I'll start with you.
Listen, I mean, I think you're always going to see more and more collaboration. Digital trade is so complicated, no single company could ever possibly solve the entire thing themselves. So ultimately, you're really frequently talking about combining multiple solutions to digitize, maybe 20, maybe 30, right? It's not a small number, it's not 2 or 3. It's a big number, which again comes to, how do you want to do it? What's going to be my front end? What's going to be my back end? How do I integrate? And we are seeing a lot more collaboration. The banks, from our perspective, we were always collaborating with, because we are a paperless trade provider. We're not a finance provider. We don't have the balance sheet of a bank. We're not going to compete with banks. So for essDOCS, there was never a competition risk with banks. And I think where you saw most of the competition with banks was really around payments, to be honest. Where a fintech can provide payments, a bank can provide payments. But when it comes to trade finance, there is no competition, right? You need the balance sheet of a bank, you need the knowledge of a bank. So a fintech can come along and it can distribute potentially in a better way. It can assist with KYC, which makes trade finance access cheaper and easier, which is massively important, because there is a huge trade finance gap that we always talk about. But ultimately, there isn't really any competition in that sense. The competition here is, bank A versus bank B. If one digitizes faster than the other, they will end up with a competitive advantage. There's no doubt about that. The problem with collaboration, though, is it requires a level of maturity. So there's two elements to this. If a fintech is newly minted, it's just gone off and raised some money, they will have promised the world to their investors. And it's difficult for them to say, oh, I'm going to collaborate with this person and therefore not be able to make money in this particular domain because we think it'll go faster to market, because often that's a difficult conversation to have with your investors. So you need to be a fintech at a certain level of maturity on the one side from a strategic level, and then B from a technological level, because actually you need to integrate in a consistent way, in a high volume way, and that also takes a level of maturity. So you're getting a lot of collaboration, but it's still a lot of people in digital trade are sort of sub 3 years old. And that's actually very new, to be honest. And you're unlikely to have massive maturity to be able to do a lot of collaboration at that point in your life cycle.
Yeah, Deepesh, as you pointed out in your intro, these 50 plus DLT solutions that you have on your radar, the key message is they matured. So perfectly building upon the points made earlier, given an increased maturity by a vast majority of fintechs out there, yes, we do see an increased collaboration also between the fintechs, but fully to Alex's points, it's the more matured one, and you see more readiness now to collaborate, given that they matured, and we're, given that we are not only +3, but say +3 decades in the industry, we see our role as integrator, trying to connect a lot of these to make the implementation cost for every individual corporate or bank lower and lower, and with this, say, do our part to globally lower the transaction cost of digitization in trade.
So I'm going to ask a more difficult question now. What are the business models and revenue streams of these collaborations? Noting, we talked about competition, we talked about the very early stage startups sub 3 years into the market, and how are these being commercialized? Alex, perhaps I'll start with you.
I mean, I think, you can look at SureComp, right? They have an app store, they have a pretty mature partnership program. I think you're going to see a lot of that style of offering extensions, app stores that let you bolt on, ultimately with some form of revenue share at the back end on the business model. I think this is pretty tried and tested arena. The issue here is, getting it to work at scale that makes value for both partners, and then that's the difficulty, right? And again, you end up with that classic critical mass chicken and egg issue that you get a lot in digital trade.
Yeah, and talking about, say, the commercialization, of course, is a key issue, and we talked about the very early fintechs that dream of, say, fantastic commercialization of the world. With the matured ones, a certain value proposition is shaping. So now talking about essDOCS and SureComp collaborating, essDOCS, Alex, you have a very clear set of value proposition. So do we. There's a non-compete space in that area. So it's good to collaborate. And we can join forces, and we bring even more value, and not to us individually, but to our clients. And only if we bring value to our clients, there is value to be turned into revenue, and this revenue can be shared. And from that logic, if it's good for the corporates to use some of these services, if it's good for the banks to join, then there's value, and this value can be shared, only this one. So if it wasn't for the value increase that any of the corporations can bring, then there's no value to be shared, and there's no commercial aspect in it. So that's why the inner logic of collaboration is easier with matured business partners. It's because their value proposition is much clearer than at the beginning of a journey of any fintech.
So has it worked? Can you go into a bit more detail? How has SureComp and essDOCS, let's say, perhaps been able to go to a bank and add value? What's been the added value from SureComp, and what's been the added value from essDOCS, and how has that enabled benefits for both?
Well, I mean, as Enno said, right, we both have specific value propositions that are completely unoverlapping, right? essDOCS is never going to go off and build a bank core banking system. But for a bank where process and change management is difficult, if you can get your e-presented documents directly into your core banking system, it makes your life considerably easier, right? I don't have to run two systems. I don't have to run two processes. Everything is interconnected. My data can flow through. If I'm getting data out of a bill of lading, I can automate my back office checks, even if it's just my sanction screening checks. At least that piece can be automated. If I can go all the way of doing my doc checks as well in an automated sense, you're really starting to get some of the value of digitization. So, we bring the e-presentation and the data, but SureComp brings the core operating system that the bank's using in the first instance to process and record all these transactions. And the two obviously work and provide much more value together than if they were running as two different systems.
Yeah. Well, Alex, if you ever need a sales position, just call me. Couldn't have been said better. That's exactly it.
Excellent. I think that's a really good piece to end this session, actually, and a really good example of a collaboration that one might actually think could be competition to a point. And I think as the trade industry gets incredibly more and more complex and nuanced, it's important to understand who does what, how you can collaborate to add more value. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that, particularly as a lot of the new and emerging trade techs enter the market and also mature. I think another really key point from this webinar is digital transformation means different things for different people, whether it's the corporates or the banks. For some, it might mean getting rid of the fax machine or looking at a really laser point in that complex trade journey and addressing that problem. For others, it might be a much wider, bigger piece to really operationalize, bring down cost, and hopefully then be able to look at risk in a different way. I think the other really big conclusion from this is actually the legal landscape, although very important and changing in terms of the adoption of MLETR in G7 markets in the next 12 months. It's not just a legal challenge, it really is a change management challenge. So thank you very much for highlighting that. I'm afraid I think that's all we've got time for. So Enno and Alex, thank you very much for joining us.
Deepesh, thank you. I was just going to say we are pretty much out of time, and we just had one last question come in, which I thought might be quite interesting if we can get really quick answers. What are the views of the speakers on blockchain? Digitization of documents will ultimately lead to blockchain, don't you think? Enno, Alex, any last final comments on that point?
Well, maybe very quickly, blockchain can tremendously help on this, but we should never think from technology, but from the solution to a problem. Most likely, blockchain is a very powerful solution to this problem.
Great.
My view. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think blockchain will be a tool set in a digital arsenal, but it won't be the core.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for your extremely valuable insights and contribution there. Thanks to Deepesh and Trade Finance Global for being our media partner today and supporting the webinar. Thanks to you, Alex, Enno, and thanks obviously to the audience for joining. So I will be in touch with a link to the recording, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great day.